Good afternoon, everyone. I'm super excited to be. Was already sentimental yesterday to be back in Poland, and I hope I will get more sentimental after this discussion. I'm very happy to welcome you to the panel that is called Dramaturgy and Post-Yugoslav Context. I will explain a little bit, or give some why having that panel here. But first of all, I would really like to welcome and introduce the guests. And I would like to do that by the biographies also for the economy of time. The full bios you can read in the program. But for now, I would like to introduce them, but also say in which context are they teaching for the sake of our discussion. So let's start. I don't want to start with Sergej, so I'm going to start with Ivana. Ivana Ivković is a dramaturg whose interests lay on the intersection of theater, contemporary dancing, media technology, sound art, and radiophony. She was a member of VETCO, is a member of VETCO. She teaches at European Dance Academy MA program, regularly holds workshops, and presents at international festivals, symposia, and conferences. You're sitting in the order, however. Janez Janša is a contemporary performance artist who, in his performance, conceptual, and interdisciplinary art, works focuses on the relation between art and the social and political context surrounding it. Currently, he is the head of MA program Solo Dance Authorship at the Intercity University for Dance HTT Berlin. Vujanović is a cultural worker focused on bringing together critical theory and contemporary art. She has lectured at various universities and was a visiting professor at Performance Studies Department of the University Hamburg. Since 2016, she is a team member and mentor at SNDO, School for New Dance Development, Academy of Theatre and Dance, Amsterdam. Aldo Milohnić is Associate Professor of the History of Theatre at the University of Ljubljana, Slovenia, Academy of Theatre, Radio, Film and Television, and the head of Theatre and Film Studies Center. Bojana Kunst is a philosopher, dramaturg, and theoretician of contemporary performing arts. She's a professor at the Institute of Applied Theatre Studies in Gießen, where she has been heading the international MA program Choreography and Performance since 2012. Goran Sergej Pristaš, dramaturg, co-founder, and is a member of VETCO, Performing Arts Collective, professor of dramaturgy at the Academy of Dramatic Arts, University of Zagreb. My name is Mila Pavićević. I used to be a student at that academy, and right now I'm working as a freelance dramaturg, mainly in the context of independent dancing in Berlin, and I'm also working as a researcher at the Free University Berlin on the research project and doing a PhD, which has something to do with this discussion. So I will start this. Also, not to forget to mention that Bojana was supposed to be here with us, but due to some circumstances and private life, she unfortunately couldn't be here today. And we miss her in this panel. So to start, to kick off this discussion, which I hope it won't be because we are many, just discussion between us, but we'll also soon shift to discussion between all of us. I would like to start it by telling a sort of a running joke that I encountered when I started moving to Berlin in 2013. Where in some after talk I heard about this Balkan mafia of dramaturgs that are working mainly in the West, and also I heard it towards me as very derogatory that I'm taking other people's jobs when I'm coming to the West. Not to like not to like unpack this joke further, but also stay a little bit with it. After a couple of years, I heard another joke, and then, which wasn't also a joke either, was that dramaturgs from Post-Yugoslavia cannot really separate themselves or cannot talk about anything else but about labor, context, and condition of work. First, I was very, very, very confused. I'll tell you later. Find out. No, you will. I would now leave the gossip a little bit for the aftertalk of the talk, but I wanted to actually start also by addressing this idea of specificity of dramaturgical practice coming from this context here, and also working and operating in the West, and asking about the specificity of this context, and if we can indeed claim this title of this panel as Dramaturgy and Post-Yugoslavia, and what would that actually mean. I'm also insisting on the term dramaturg, although I think some of you, or we had also a discussion in the break, like how do we actually describe what we do? But I thought for the purpose of this discussion, maybe to stay with the dramaturg is rather operational, although we might end up in defining what we do maybe differently. And yeah. So my first question is it really possible to think the specificity of aesthetics of the dramaturgical practice from the context of former Yugoslavia, thinking a bit on the line of what the publication that we all know here from 2003, Parallel Slalom, proposes and says a common Yugoslav cultural space. So instead of starting by talking about conditions of work and infrastructure, I would like to talk about poetics, or the aesthetics of what a certain way of practicing dramaturgy from this context could bring, or how could we even, I don't even have the words, but can we try to articulate the specificity of its poetics, or your poetics? I think it would be good not to start with the co-editor. I can maybe, but some of the contributors. But maybe Janez, you could start by thinking about.
Okay, maybe not to avoid the question, but it's a little bit what we had in earlier discussion. I think, yes, there is certain poetics and aesthetics, yeah, but I think there are things that if something is connecting people that sit here, is, I don't know, for me much, let's say much bigger or much substantial. I think we should always ask ourselves, whenever we come to some kind of geography or territory, which cultural context of former Yugoslavia, because it's not, it's very particular. It's coming from urban culture, subculture with experimental agenda and so on. So I think this would be first thing. There is a certain social context and also certain social conditioning that, let's say, maybe brought us now sitting together and collaborating a lot in the past. Yeah? That also means relation to political circumstances in which basically many things that now are that we are busy with now were actually something that we constructed or created. And maybe one of the things that is so connecting all of us is that there was kind of integral relation towards artistic, dramaturgical, reflective, theoretical research dimension of artistic work. And if I would then need to answer quickly about poetics, aesthetics, and so on, maybe these 5 things that I mentioned actually are the poetics or aesthetics. So research, reflection, artistic practice, dramaturgy, plus of course our social ties, which are very different from context to context, but they were always present and always necessary condition. We were not cut from reality in which we were living and also working. So that would be my first attempt. Yeah.
Maybe we can take this line of thinking further. I think what my question was in a way very different than trying to separate the aesthetic from the social, but rather to think what kind of conditions in our own fields helped or made it difficult to articulate what we do, and how actually this idea of poetic is also embedded in the methodologies or in the realities, in the ways of work that we are doing. But maybe we could also turn this question a little bit towards production of works, and how poesis in a sense of production of works, and because I know that we all are used to working in a context here and then using the model of co-production, or just the work somehow is very different from pogon to dance or many other Western contexts where this is shown. So maybe to talk about a little bit how is also this question reflected in the way of producing work. And I don't want to open this up. There is scarce resources there, and there is much resources in other spheres.
Thank you for the question. I will connect your first question with the second one, and also what Janez said. I was just thinking how the first question was also formulated with this number of the issue in the and I was also
the mic is not on.
Oh, sorry. I was also thinking that XU at that time was also a particular kind of poetic invention for us. It was a political gesture to do something what actually to do the sort of alliances and practices and thinking together on the territory which was very much apart and which we all experienced in the 90s. So this should not be forgotten. And I think this is something what is very, for me, this is a poetic question, which is very close to politics. Like, for example, why we did all these issues around practices which are in common, and why the magazines were coming together. I think it was not a kind of, we did not have any wish to do something like a common poetics or something like that, but it was very much situated in our own environments and in our own need to make a continuous invention of poetics and production and politics of our practices, because they, in a very different ways, suffered under the consequences of what happens in the beginning of the 90s, also in a very different ways, in a very different context. And that's why, for me, if I think, like, if I remember back how we were creating those magazines, sometimes also in relation to some international partners and so on, there were really these attempts of invention, almost like scratching the discourse, but at the same time persisting the right to have this discourse, to be visible and so on. And this is for me the core of the poetic question here. And I think that can be then related to that what we are working with today, but maybe we can speak about that later, but I just wanted to add that. And I think for me, all the questions are going from there.
Thank you, Mila, for the questions. They're really not easy. I will try to say something about poetics and my poetical origin. I would say, like, maybe we can say it in a simple way. 20 years ago, when I started working professionally, I was interested in experimenting in art. And I was not interested in achieving a standard of a city theater production. That was totally out of question for me. And then in order to make experimental art, whatever it means, for me it meant like to experiment, like to let yourself imagine things, to try new procedures, to combine styles which are not usually combinable in a way and so on. For that, and it was after the 90s, and we were, in walking theory we were a little bit younger than some others here, so they were also important for us as a reference and discovery of the early 2000s, but we had to invent and to create the circumstances to make that art, because there was no space for that. And then it coincided with a big political change that we had in Serbia, which was the overturn of Slobodan Milohnić's regime and the democratic regime coming and taking the power. And then the democratic regime recognized us, contemporary art, experimental art, as contributing to democratizing the society. And then they helped with grants and so on. So we were put in a position to create conditions for us to produce that type of art. And from that starting point, it naturally came that we started being interested in how to make these conditions, how to collaborate, how to establish provisional institutions, how to organize collectives, how to think about decision-making procedures, and so on and so on. And then we did some things to a certain extent, and then many of us left this territory. But then also, like, moving to first Paris and then Berlin, also made me aware that somehow the world outside is totally not welcoming these questions. It's just individualist world where, okay, we can thematize a little bit diversities, experiments and so on, but not really in the way how we work. And then I was shocked. I started speaking about that. And then what also usually happens with these marginal positions is that I'm also very often invited to speak about these topics, which petrifies me in the position of a dramaturg and theorist obsessed with the ways of working and producing. And then, because we are human beings and I still consider myself an experimental person, I also changed over time. So now I have new interests. For instance, in landscape dramaturgy. And for the last 5-6 years, I've been working a lot on that. But then when I submitted the proposal to publish a book, they said, oh no, you cannot write. Why you about landscape dramaturgy? That's not your field, that's not your topic. And then on purpose I continued, and also with my partner Marta Popivoda, we made some cinematic installations, performances, films and so on. We now insist on our way of making art in poetical terms. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes not, but it is confusing. Because it's not a discourse on which I automatically have a right. So it's really difficult position. So also these jokes, they're funny to an extent. I like also to be put in the same group with these amazing people around me and Bojana. But on the other hand, it's painful because it's not really my free choice. I'm also to a large extent put in that position and kept in that position. Even when I'm not that much, I'm older enough, I don't want to do collective, I don't have time for that. I want to experiment with landscape dramaturgy. But no. Yeah. So that was maybe also my own path in terms of poetics.
I can continue here with my view, my experience, my view. But now I'm trying to recall, how it was in 1990, 1991, when we started the new old journal, Maska. And it was a kind of huge break, in a way. Of course, it was at that time, there was a very dramatic time of splitting of the former Yugoslavia, and then the war started. So, in political terms, it was very really dramatic time. On the other hand, in the 80s, let me speak now about Slovenian scene, about Slovenian theater. Some new practices emerged at the beginning, in the early 80s, like so-called political theater, which was something very much discussed in the former Yugoslavia, not only Slovenia, but the whole former Yugoslavia, with a typical representative from Slovenia, Mladinsko theater. And it was a certain kind, particular kind of aesthetics, but also not only, it was not only about aesthetics, of course, it was also about the social and political context at that time in Slovenia and the former Yugoslavia. And then in the late 80s, some new practices emerged with, especially then in the early 90s, with a new generation of theater directors, actors, and also dramaturgs. And at that time, on old Maska, an old journal which used to be published under the name Masks, so in plural, and it was run by older generation of dramaturgs. They simply wanted new generation to continue with new editorial board and so on. So we were invited to take over actually the journal, which was a huge chance and of course a challenge for all of us. And the break which happened was precisely that we got a new media to not only to reflect those new practices, but also to contribute more organically in it. So this, what Janez said, this constant communication and exchange of theory, so-called theory and so-called practice, I think that we can discuss both terms, but it was very organic in that sense. And then, of course, later on, in mid-90s, Frakcija started, and then late 90s or 2000, 2001, Teoria
Aldo, maybe, not to interrupt you, but to interrupt you a little bit, maybe we can ask, because you're giving me my next question. I think there are two very interesting lines of thinking now, articulating. One is this, to think a space for experimentation as a necessity from coming from a position of scarcity or where contemporary art doesn't exist or it doesn't exist in that form, and then this constant exercise of reimagining yourself within that context and then your work. And this kind of, there is this, which I also can relate very much to what you're saying, Anna, is doing dramaturgy because it's not theater, and then situating yourself anywhere outside to do something arts related around certain notions that are interesting for you aesthetically, politically, socially, but it fits into this dramaturgy framework. So that's one thing, and the other is this production of, or this situated knowledge that Bojana mentioned, and also then my question would be how this knowledge or this experience of the context here works within magazines that we have here, and also within your institutions and your universities that are now mainly in the West. But maybe we start from the locals. So Sergej, maybe you can say something about how the experience of Yugoslav context influences your teaching here and when you go elsewhere.
Yeah, but on the line of what these amazing people, as Anna said, were saying, maybe just to paraphrase what Boris Groisman said about the difference between Western and Eastern European art, claiming that there is no difference, but in the fact that it comes from the Eastern Europe, which in the same time means nothing, but also a lot. That this fact that this comes from these conditions, as you just described, basically means that it's produced out of the same matter, but doesn't matter the same way. And that's something that was pretty important for us, stepping up onto a new stage, which was at the time turning from one state organization into another new state structures, smaller contexts, but oriented towards Europe and so on. And at the same time, not working also in all of these respective countries in the same conditions. So Slovenia was Slovenia was very fast towards EU, like in Croatia there was an empty ground in the 90s, from 91, 90 to 95. It was almost everything erased by the national culture, It took some time to people to recover through self-organization. In Serbia, we couldn't even know what's going on there. Eugenio Barba was there still hanging on the walls, and walking theory was struggling, to invent situation, even of possible thinking about the theater differently, not to come to a situation of doing something. So some of these people I never met in Yugoslavia. Bojana Kunst I met as a young shooting dramaturgical star in Amsterdam, in '95. Anna, of course, with walking theory later on. Okay, Aldo I met very early via the same admission exam at the academy. He failed. What I wanted to say with this just differentiation was that there were different speeds, different situations, and we were using each other somehow to ride the waves. Sometimes we would lean more on the side of Slovenia, which had Maska, we could identify with them and so on. Sometimes we turned towards Belgrade to claim that we are more Yugoslav than we are, that we can say loudly and so on. But one thing, if I would say, which was important for me at that time, was that I met many people who were over-identifying with what they do, which was not the case around, because it was a time of so-called new dramaturgy, all the types of postmodern relativization of everything that we do, of all the practices, all the concepts were changing suddenly. This whole new dramaturgy thing with theaterschrift was like super seductive, but we couldn't see it around ourselves, so we had to really start to believe that it also exists there where it doesn't, So we had to start journals to invent in small parts of some performances, something that might become a seed for something else. That's at least how Frakcija started. Frakcija was writing about the scene that didn't exist and claimed that this is the best thing that happens in the world. And also some other people started to believe it, which was very good. Like Ivana. So, just to conclude, not to go too far into this argumentation, but this over-identification with what we do, but also then with some concepts, and especially with the recent past, in a way, so-called Yugoslav past, of the art of 60s, 70s, 80s, which was very much present in the work of all of people here, recognizing that as a cultural context in which we work, which is also important just because it comes from here, from the same matter, but doesn't matter the same way, and for us always matters, specifically with this Yugoslav feeling that we somehow, at least for a while, inherited, and that there is something special about Yugoslavia. Whatever it was, we couldn't articulate, but we felt that we are coming from a special thing. I remember in Vienna when they called us Balkan Intifada, and that we wanted to believe that there is something like that, and that we have to push it through. And dramaturgy as a concept was actually excellent for that, because none of us could or would be happy even to define. It could be everything and non-disciplinary completely, so it was changeable. And most of us turned towards, as Anna said, not theater, but whatever else, just to show that it can appear there where we don't recognize it yet, and that we can be productive there. And that's what brought me closer to some people there. Sorry.
Maybe I can, Ivana can say something about Frazia, but before, I would like to just, maybe you can say how this experience shaped the education, because that was the question. So how does all of that impact your teaching?
Yeah, so I'm a mastodont at the Academy of Dramatic Arts. I think that maybe only few people are longer there than me, because I never left it since I enrolled as a student. I studied when we had only 3 professors, and I'm teaching there now when we have 13 or how many? 30. It was changing all the time. The great thing, why I like to work there, is that it's constantly changing, not only because of the fact that we are having new teachers, new professors with new ideas, but actually because students come with different possibilities that are opening there, and that identify themselves with the dramaturgy, also without really caring if this is a work of a director or a performer or choreographer in some case. And I think that this transformative force which I see in the work of a dramaturg when it comes to recognition of what is in the field of vision and what is not, and how to transform the rules, how something appears or not, is what also influences the teaching that I'm doing there, or maybe not to call it necessarily teaching, but trying to switch from teaching to possibility for opening situation for studying.
I think Ivana wanted to say something, and then Anna, and then I would encourage you to ask these wonderful people questions, that we open up a little bit.
So I'm also thinking maybe some 20-25 years back, like Anna, and how I felt an urge to go from being an audience member or a member of a readership of a journal, an urge to take part and to have this, as you said, right or to discourse. And perhaps I was very, very naive. It's hard to say looking back, but it never even occurred to me that I would study as a theater director, for example. Why not? Immediately I thought the way to go is to study dramaturgy, and I went to the academy. And I did not at all have a feeling of scarcity at that moment. I was not looking towards, I don't know, Berlin or London. I really felt that I was in a very interesting context. In Zagreb also, not just in this wider regional context, with things going on at Eurocas Festival, with maybe having a chance to go and see something in Ljubljana, at Cankarjev Dom, with Frakcija, with all the other things that were happening, with CEDEL organizing some showcases, some events that opened up conversations. So I did not at all feel that I was entering into a position of scarcity, but I felt that there was plenty and that going into a study of dramaturgy would be a very good way to have access, to have the possibility to to take part in the discourse, and then reflection, and then being part of the journal. This all came later. I mean, you said let's not start with infrastructure, but eventually we'll have to go back to the topic of infrastructure, how I felt that part of this infrastructure which was there, the theaters or some of the other festivals, that they were not this world of plenty for me, but that they were ossified institutions doing something that I did not want to take part in, also because of identity issues in the late 90s, early 2000s, as Sergej mentioned. So there was a path through this very, very lively landscape that immediately would, I felt, take us in, make us agents in how it was further developing. So it's not now being sentimental looking 20 years back. I was even more excited then and felt even more somehow lively and plentiful and generous than now with sentimentality looking 2 decades back.
I wanted, and I hope that I will manage to do it briefly. If not, then I will leave the answer open. But I would like to think about this double position, like what you asked Mila about, how it looks like from the perspective of a magazine that was published in Belgrade for 17 years, like a very long period, and then on the other hand, like when I work and teach mostly in Amsterdam and other Western European cities, I wanted to say that when we started with walking theory in 2001, both Mask and Frakcija already existed, and they were a big reference to me. Because I was looking for something else, and Sergej reminded me on Eugenio Baba hanging on the wall. So, okay, alternative scene in Serbia was not an option for me. I was already clever enough to understand the problems. On the other hand, a mainstream culture which was very traditional, institutionalized, and not interesting at all, and totally not relevant. So then I was looking at Mask and Frakcija as you know, like bright stars over there. Aha, it's possible to think like that, to work like that, to make art like that, or to invent. I was not aware at that moment that it was an invention. They were my references, because in Serbia I didn't have that reference. I just had the wish. Because I tried to be educated, but in the 90s I didn't travel. I was a kid, and then attended high school and university, but we didn't travel. I didn't have any references. I didn't know the world. I didn't know anything. Anyways, Mask and Frakcija were big references for me, and because of Mask, I actually learned to read Slovenian. That was because how else? I want to know something that was like that, really, 20 years ago. But anyways, then there was also on a private level the fact that I was born in Belgrade, and then I lived in the 90s in Belgrade. But before 90s, I was not aware that I was not a Serb, because nobody thematized that. We were just in a big city, in former Yugoslavia, people coming from all over and so on. And then in the early 90s, I realized, okay, my father comes from Montenegro, my mother comes from Croatia, so it's more than just geographical location. It means more, and so on. And then for me, somehow I felt, on a very private level, somehow I really wanted to meet people from former Yugoslavia when it was possible in early 2000s, to share that experience and to meet my people, you know, like in a way to say, like, also you have, I don't know, father you said from Montenegro and mother from Serbia. That's very close to me, but in Serbia I didn't have it. I didn't feel that I had it, so it was very important on that private level also to share that experience and these kind of things. But I must say, if I speak like from a bit, if I zoom out a little bit, it's not only Mask and Frakcija. I also remember, I know I saw Dea and Nina here, Urban Festival in Zagreb, and Mama. Also two very important references for me. which also with whom I share this idea of what we can do with the art in society. And then I think that I didn't feel Yugoslav somehow, and I also, for me, Yugoslavia was a memory from childhood, and I didn't feel Yugoslav. I rather felt affiliated with these people here and with these groups and so on, my colleagues, my comrades and so on. But when I left Yugoslavia, I noticed that I was always invited to different panels and discussions as Eastern European. And then I was like, oh, but I have never been Eastern European. It's only now that I'm Eastern European. I had to explain, look, I'm not Eastern European and so on. So I had to, because yeah, that was the biggest achievement of the Yugoslavia. We had never been Eastern Europeans. And you know, like our grandparents, they were at the concentration camp at Vojanović and so on, and all these things. So they were not Eastern Europeans. But then I also had to learn more about what Yugoslavia was and what our legacy was and so on. And so I think that I became Yugoslav finally, or post-Yugoslav, only in Berlin, Amsterdam, and Paris. So, and then, yes, and now, okay, I understand, I'm Yugoslav, that's it. But I still want to recognize Dramaturgy.
I think maybe for most of the audience this is already known, or you can relate to this, but still I would like to open the floor for first questions, if they are. Oh.
Okay, so maybe just not to get the impression from people who are not from the Yugoslav context or ex-Yugoslav that things started happening ex nihilo, like after the nationalistic madness. So I would be interested to hear, I don't know, whoever from you, Aldo already started talking a bit about it for the 80s, Anna, you mentioned it in the end, but I would be interested to hear how the Yugoslav heritage, especially the experimental art practices in different collectives and everything that was happening at that time, informs your practice nowadays. How do you relate to that practice and how do you somehow relate to that history? In order just not to forget that history. It's not like in the 90s where everything started, or there was baseline.
Yeah, this basically is a local question. Because in a certain moment, as already some of these amazing people said, you somehow look for the context. You somehow try to co-create. You somehow try to influence the context in which you operate. And one of them is also historical context. So where do you want to inscribe yourself? What are the points of reference that you somehow find relevant for your own practice? And in that sense, there was a lot of work, and still there is, in affirming things from the past, from the local context, which, let's say, mainstream local context more or less eliminated or covered it, and so on. So I think this was and still is an important work to be done, also in political terms, and also if you want to stay with initial poetic, also in poetic terms. So when you are declared to be a post-Yugoslav, which post-Yugoslav you are? Which post-Yugoslavia are we talking about? And then, to answer that question properly, of course, you have to go in the back and you will see that post-Yugoslavia existed much earlier, maybe even during Yugoslavia, and maybe even before Yugoslavia itself existed. And of course, this can be also very subjective and ethical question. But I think that is also something that then forms also the other question that you asked, and that is a way of education. How can you actually come on a stage, let's say, imagine we are now having this in Amsterdam or in Berlin, this talk, so Berliners organize this talk in the core, on a big stage, on Volksbühne. Why do you need to, legitimize and justify that a certain practice, the relevance of certain practice that so unavoidably conditions your work. Why do we need to do that? If they come here, they don't do this. Legitimizing the relevance of, let's say, some cultural, artistic, aesthetic, poetic practice.
I'm also one who remembers these 80s because I'm old. Exactly. Not okay. I will not comment. But many of the spirit of what we've been doing in the 90s also came out of the spirit from the 80s, because all of us came out of punk. Or, okay, Aldo had a guitar which was not popular at that time, but all the others, I remember Emil being retrograde guy, like shaven in dark suits and so on. So, but we had a bit of problem with the 80s somehow, because in the 90s, when everything was wiped out, we realized what was the problem of anti-institutional thinking of the 80s. This complete resistance towards the institutionalization of practices, fight for self-organization and so on. Because when the wave of nationalism came, it was just wiped out. Now, I meet some people, like there is now in Croatia, in Orthodox Church, there is one Orthodox priest who was important figure in the 80s at the new wave scene, and punk was connected to Padotna Byzantia and so on, who were gathering also here at that point. And now we are trying to recollect when meeting, okay, not in church or somewhere else, but through some types of communication, what was actually going on at that time, which might result in what happens here. But most of these people, somehow from the 80s, ended up in a kind of church situations if they didn't transform in the 90s. So that kind of generation is still preserved. Like Indosh is here with us as one of those who was really changing from the 80s and 90s and later on into something that was pretty different. If there is nostalgia in Croatia now, it's about new wave and the 80s repeating and reproducing itself. But it's not, when you go into the practices of what was developing in the 90s, zeros and so on, nobody was claiming the 80s at that time. Not because it was Yugoslavia, but just because there were some weird feelings about that very recent past that also brought us up. But the spirit was the same.
Okay, very short. Just wanted to react to what Slavša asked. I think that Janez already actually answered the question, but maybe just to add a little bit more. As an example, of course, when you are looking back to the past, you can, of course, try to do it in a, how to say, research ethical way, so that you try to, not to be too ideological in thinking about past practices. As you heard at the beginning, I'm teaching history of theater at the academy, so I have to constantly to question my own position in it, my own interpretations, and what I'm trying to teach students or to stimulate them to think about, and what is important from the past and what is maybe not that important. So it is always, judging in a way. But I would say, of course, you simply can't escape that position, which is our internal ideology. We have to fight with it all the time, but you simply find in the past, you can find certain practices that you feel as being your contemporary colleagues. And it is not only about 80s. We had a lot of excellent practices from the theater practices and experiments from the 80s we could identify with, but also, let's say, 60s. late 60s. And what we did at Maska, it was, so Janez did the reconstruction of a very, very important, well, from our perspective, very important show of the Popilja Verkewerk Theater. So it was the performance, but at the same time we produced, I was working on the book on Popilja Verkewerk, which was really important research of that particular experimental theater group from the late 60s. And then Maska organized a so-called shocking gala show, which was again a kind of reenactment of the old event. They named it Shocking Gala Show in the late 60s. So it was really, you know, it was an attempt to bring an old issue, you know, a past event to our contemporary situation. At that time it was 10 years or more. Yeah, in 2009 probably.
2007. 2007.
7? Shocking Gala Show.
Shocking was in 2009.
2009.
No, sorry, Popilja. I was talking about
Popilja was
Popilja.
2006.
Yeah, but yeah, okay. So of course, I mean that's the way how well, we tried to somehow, you know, re-actualize certain, you know, historical events that we found important. You know, so that's and just one thing I wanted to add to what we started to speak about at the beginning. So I mentioned the early 90s and the beginning of Maska, and Anna mentioned 2000, so 10 years later, with the beginning of Teoria Koja, and in the meantime, it was Frakcija. When I said it was important and very dramatic break, I wanted to say a very simple thing, which is now very simple when I'm thinking back. You know, at that time it was a bloody important thing for us, at least for me. At that time, when, you know, Germany was integrating, unifying, and on the other hand, former Yugoslavia was falling apart in a very bloody war. At that time, I personally, I had to find something I could believe in. You know, precisely those practices at that time, you know, late 80s, early 90s, in theater, in theory, in activism of that time, all these things were, I would say, something you could believe in. So that's why I wanted to say that for some of us it was very, very important to create and to have that kind of organizations, platforms, to create a certain space for thinking, for, you know, any kind of activism and producing art.
My answer to your question, Slavče, is very concrete. Yes, in my case, this experiment from historical avant-gardes and new avant-gardes, they were very important, and I was aware of them, but they were not part of the curriculum. At the University of the Arts, nobody has ever mentioned that. And even the course called Art History was not really good at the Faculty of Dramatic Arts. And then together with some other colleagues, I went to the Faculty of Architecture, where Irina Subotic, amazing art historian from older generations, she was teaching there, and her course was in historical avant-gardes. And I'm just trying to reconstruct. I lived in total isolation. I had never traveled. I didn't have books from abroad. Nothing, you know, like just isolation for 10 years. And then when I started attending her lectures and I discovered surrealism, futurism, and so on, I felt really affiliated somehow with that, and I felt because I agree with the basic premise that we need to question, to criticize and to question the society around us and invent maybe a better society. And these experiments were very exciting. And then I had a really big luck that my professor Mila Pavićević, she gave me a job. She gave us a lot of jobs, students at that time. Like there was a new center for new theater and dance. It was called like that. In 1999, and then they employed me as a very young person to do a research and archive of new theater and dance in Serbia, like from the beginning of time. And then I started researching, and then I discovered Marina Abramović and other artists from the 60s, the 70s, and so on. And I collaborated with another, not art historian, but esthetician, Miško Šuvaković, who at that time started working at the University of the Arts. And he was a kind of, youngest member of this glorious generation of the 70s body artists, performance artists, and so on. And he brought it to the academy. And it was precious. So I did my archive, and it still exists in certain traces, where I learned everything about these alternative scenes from different decades and so on. But when I started working, like myself at that time, in early 2000s, they were all either old or maybe not living any longer. So I didn't have a living, references. So these people here and there, magazines and lectures and performances, they were very lively environment in which I started working. And these other things, they were from books and some photographs and so on. And then I also, I think, contributed a little bit to including these references into teaching and so on, but it's not my big contribution. The main contribution came from Miško Šuvaković, who really established it, and now it's a kind of canon. So everyone knows it. That's a canon. That's how you learn about, and he edited books about art in Serbia in the 20th century, and then we wrote texts in performing arts. So it's now a common knowledge. So I think he totally changed the landscape of knowledge and our field in art and critical art and so on. So
I wanted, exactly for you, Bojana, I wanted to circle back to this idea of situated knowledge and to ask how actually the knowledge that was produced in these independent magazines that were produced by NGOs outside of institutional interest, and all of these experiences for all of you that work as teachers, how does this participate in your process of teaching in Germany, and not only teaching, heading a master program?
Yeah, I could really connect to that. We'll try really also to connect to Slavcov and to Anna, because we should not forget that we were actually, like, if I talk about my situation, I was finishing my studies in '95 in Ljubljana. It was impossible to learn about those practices at the academia in the university. There was the knowledge stopped at the end of 19th century. There were some examples, and this is a very, very important part of what we were doing. On the other side, I felt that we were living in a time, like it was after or the war was still going, or Yugoslavia was apart, we were having a new state, there was joining to the European Union. It was a very accelerated and really conflictual temporality we were living in. On one side, there was this kind of negotiation with European Union, opening up, democratization processes. There was a kind of a fake idea that performance and dance are immediately democratic because they're dealing with the body and blah, 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 blah. So how to deal with these accelerated and conflictual temporalities, and at the same time, institutionally, those practices were not visible at all. So for me, a very big part of this situatedness was also to think about time, like temporality, like what kind of temporality we are living in, like how to think about that. And I know that I was very busy in the 90s when I started to write for Maska. It was like at the end of 90s, and then with the first articles, I was really obsessed with this temporality, and this is something I'm really now returning to when teaching a lot, because that really gave me the basis to deal with the problems we are having now, also with all I don't know, the colonial theories or approaches on temporality. It's a very important question at that time. And I think that was something, like for example, I remember that at Moscow we then did this seminar for performing arts, which was actually an attempt, beside the magazine, beside the practices, to develop the platform where we can exchange, produce knowledge. Even we were like really joking, we have to raise a new generation of thinkers. And this is actually what really happened. That's why we could also leave, even if maybe some of you did not want to leave and so on, but it is very important. And I think this is a very important part of the context. And I don't know if I answer you directly, but that's exactly how I think about teaching. This is exactly where I think, even if I'm now teaching in Gießen, and it's a particular setting, I had to learn a lot also about German academic environment and so on. For me, that was always new, but Gießen was an environment for me where I could bring this kind of, how do we create alliances through time? How do we create politics through time? Like, how do we discuss this? Like, that's for me in the core of my teaching, this kind of really continuous need to reinvent models and practices, and I think this is for me very poetic. It's not and that's why I was also thinking that maybe we should also think from another perspective, because Klausa asked about references and so on. Yugoslavia has also another reference, not just the kind of affirmative and so on, but Yugoslavia was always a symptom of capitalism for me, like what will come. A bit, like if you think about the 70s, the opening to tourism, and there were a lot of symptoms present where you could really read what will happen with neoliberal globalization and so on. And maybe these initial questions of yours that now we are addressed as somebody who is discussing labor, we also were the symptoms of what will come for our organizations. And I sometimes really read it like that. No? All this kind of the precarity, the kind of what we talked today also in the discussion about institutions, how institutions were actually busy with themselves and the processes and so on. This is something what we actually came from another political situation, but at the same time we also produced a lot of these symptoms. I speak now more from the Slovenian situation, where there were a lot of these symptoms and the kind of precarity of actors produced and so on. So it's very interesting also to think from that perspective. So again, somehow I would say that this post-you could also be read as a symptom, as it was read as a symptom in the 70s, and it was read for this kind of neoliberal capitalism, which is connected with commodification, enjoyment, and so on, which was very present. So that's another perspective. I would just like to bring it into the discussion.
I think the aspect of temporality is something which is super interesting, because on one side it addresses the perspective from which someone is speaking and which histories does this person address, and the other, for me, it envisions the idea of a future, and this is where I'm afraid we will not reach today, but there is this idea of future of arts, or why do we do what we do still in the world that is like that, which is connected with the idea of values, and then it becomes even more complicated to think not only what happened, but how do we go on from now. But Sergej wanted to say something, and then Ivana, and then I have my eyes for the...
Just maybe to add to, again, to Slavčo's question, 90s were also very important because in the 90s we were very well informed, unlike in the 80s. Unlike the 90s when everything collapsed, in the 80s we had everything here. I mean, Yugoslavia was a place of self-sufficiency in a way. I was always asking my older friends, why didn't you go touring with your shows in Europe, or why didn't you exhibit around? And they said, we didn't have to, you know, like we had enough of space here. Everybody was coming here to see the thing, so they didn't want to go anywhere. So we had BITE. All the most important performances were coming to BITE from wherever, from the Eastern Europe and Western. There was music biennial in Zagreb. Later on in the 80s, we could see late 80s, we could see already young Faber Rosas, all of the work at Eurocast Festival. You know. We've been, at that time, we used money to travel to Vienna to see Wiener Festwochen or to go to Berlin to see performances. That was not the problem. What I feel as a very problematic situation today here is that our students do not have it. Now, we are far lower than ever before in terms of cultural presence of the work in performance. Uncomparable to anything from the 80s, even zeros. But that resonance, that things matter if they are presented here and not only somewhere else, stayed for a while in the 90s and in the zeros. So for me, this thing it's a kind of Benjaminian feeling that however microcosmically you work, it always matters. That's something that I somehow think was quite an important and specific thing for this place here. And this situation, when I would go, for example, somewhere in Vienna, and say, but why couldn't you stand up against something? And everybody says, like, but it doesn't matter. I mean, who would care about it? I mean, that's something I never felt here, you know, that if we don't stand up against something, that somebody will not react. Because we could still call Minister of Culture, or what are you doing, you know. We could find that number at least.
To go back to the question of teaching, Bojana just reminded us of Master Seminar, and I've just been thinking of all the, and often it was in parallel learning and teaching that happened through self-organized infrastructure that would appear, disappear, sometimes stay longer, sometimes was almost at the level of maybe a festival, including Master Seminar, including what Ex-Scena was doing, women's studies and peace studies in Zagreb, which are still going on. I mean, just individual lectures and events like this one that we would organize, or our context would organize at MAMA or CDU. And I'm thinking now also of Noma Dance Academy. There's an overlap of us here. And how this was a little bit later, a moment that also attempted to build its own regional, and is still building and rebuilding its own regional infrastructure of also education and dissemination. For me, it was also, because I came into this very late after an earlier career, it was somehow fascinating to be able to almost in the same moments be in the position of teaching and being a student. And I think this is, it's interesting for me. We start today with thinking forward of a new academic program, but I think all of these various moments are kind of built into how also that program is currently being built.
So to fast forward Slavča's question to a bit more recent history, I think it's also interesting for a wide audience to hear. It's an open question for all of you to reflect a bit about the differences in the individual context that influenced on your decisions or necessities to leave. Right? Continuing the conversation we had yesterday with Janez, you said that you didn't want to leave, right? You wouldn't have left if it wasn't for personal reasons, if I'm not correct. So yeah, to speak a bit about that.
It's symptomatic. You can say it all.
No, at first. When did you leave?
2012.
Oh, I was the first one. Okay, but yeah. But we also have all different like personal histories and professional histories and so on. Like in certain point in the early 2000s, we had this democratic government which supported experimental and contemporary art, believing that it contributes to democratization of the society. But the political situation changed after a while, and then the whole independent scene became very, very precarious. And I had a little bit of, no, I had even a steady job, but not a full-time job, not employment at the university. I was teaching at the MA and PhD level of theory of art and media. It was really amazing, but I would earn maybe around 300 euros per semester. So it was not sustainable. And I had to travel everywhere around Europe to do workshops, maybe for 500 euros or even 1,000. It was amazing. And then I go back to Belgrade and I survived the whole month with that. And the other thing is that I have always been a kind of queer person, and for me it was, I have never thought of it as a problem. And then in 2004 I met Marta, and we officially she has been my partner since then. And then when we were younger, somehow it was a kind of acceptable in Belgrade, because somehow guys liked how we look like. So they would flirt when they would see us together in a club, they would do things like that. But then as we have been aging, it's becoming more and more unwanted. And then at a certain point when we realize, okay, now we are seriously together, we want to live this life, maybe to have a child at a certain point and so on, we also realized that it was totally impossible to stay in Serbia. And now I'm totally not romantic. I don't go often there. I collaborate to Bojana is here in Marijana with some small bubbles and so on. But when I usually go to Belgrade, I stay within the circles of family and friends who are totally supportive and so on. But I understand that we would be lynched there for being two lesbian women with a child. It's not possible to live there. So both from the financial and the personal position, I had to leave that country. And I left it at the moment when I realized that if I stay a little bit longer, I will become a really bitter person. But I'm not a bitter person. I'm a warm person. I want to love people. So I felt that it was very toxic for me, and I had to leave, and I don't regret. I think it was really the best decision in my life. And then I realized how much of this internalized homophobia I had in Serbia because of the context, and things like that. So I'm so happy that I don't live there and that I somehow survive. I'm still very precarious and so on, but that's a price that I pay for living the life that I really love my life. And that's these are my reasons to live. That's why I grabbed the microphone, because I have the whole story to tell everyone. Thank you for asking. Yeah, because I also know. Now we made a film which is not about that. It's about anti-fascism, but in the film we made it also clear that we are together and that we love because of that. And now I have messages from younger colleagues from my context saying thank you for that. So for many people it's still not possible. So I'm very proud. Yeah, for us it's possible.
Yeah, you said that you left in the moment that you felt that otherwise it would become very toxic. I think I had the same experience, but from a different reason. It was really a decision in one moment, because I tried for years to go out of the precarious situation. I left in Slovenia after I did a kind of doctorate, and then I had luck that I had still a postdoc in Antwerp. And then I started to really freelance and travel all the time, and started to search for a possibility if I can in any way join a little bit of any university in Ljubljana. At the end, I was working for 5 universities in Slovenia. At every I had 10% or 5%. So actually, it was really existential. And with the family, then we decided in one moment. And my toxic moment was that I started to become very angry and in a very schizophrenic situation. And because I had a kind of feeling that I can really work and think, and I really wanted to work with students. I'm really a teacher. I feel like that by profession. And that was not possible. So that was actually the decision to leave, which for me was not so easy, because I felt very well personally there, and I still have to negotiate, so it's a different story. But what is very paradoxical with that, and that goes back to what happened maybe in Slovenia after 2000, is that whenever I return now to Slovenia, Aldo knows that I was lecturing. My last lecture in Slovenian was, I think, before 6 years. Otherwise, I always return with an English lecture to Slovenia. And this is for me a symptom of something, and always in the international context. And with the international context, and I was really thinking about a problem of what is going on, that there is a kind of shrinking of context, where you could really pursue these topics. It's more or less an international context, and then I come. So there's something very paradoxical there. And so it's an interesting question. What does internationalization also means, and how do you return back and then speak actually in this language? It was so beautifully described by Julia yesterday, and so on. You even go back and speak in this language. So, and that gave me a lot of thinking about in what kind of industry we are actually participating. What is that? What we are doing? And that's something I think I challenge, or I think a lot about that, and what kind of diasporic identities are also creating this industry. This is for me a very important question to think about.
When did you leave?
I don't dare to put myself in the lineage yet, but I left. Well, I started leaving 2012, 13, but then I left 2017
For what reasons?
I can relate to both, actually, but also I remember this moment. I was driving on a bike from the only hilly place in Berlin, from Hammerplatz to Agora. Where Agora was in the next to Kindle before, and then I said, it's over, I cannot go back, and this is how it was. Yeah. It was like love, and I think it was love for the possibility to do dramaturgical work in a way how you like it, and to actually have a rather comfortable life also, not struggling always, but it also was a sense of freedom that I experienced that very strongly. And now Berlin has other restrictions, but still less. And when did you leave, Jan?
A year ago, like fully, for love, for personal, not for Berlin or hills or bikes. It's terrible to bike in Berlin compared to Ljubljana. So another task for a new mayor of Berlin to work on. I don't know. I have to say that when Bojana left, it was a big loss for local context, and also I felt it personally, professionally, because Bojana was in that time, in many years that we were working together, key or very important dialogue partner, plus everything that she did and we did together. But the dialogues, this is something that is basically invisible. You know, when you talk with people, have you seen this and did you read that text? Like small things that actually are substance of our lives. Julia talked a little bit, like how can you apply, look, I need time to talk with Bojana on a coffee. Like how can you, which institution can you apply to get resources for something that really matters, I think what Bojana said is a big problem of Ljubljana, and this problem radicalized just after you left with the crisis and austerity measures and the right-wing turn, which is basically entire society moved right-wing. So today they call the left party of Slovenia like a radical leftist, but there is nothing radical in the politics of that party. But the shift, the entire shift, and of course it's not only Slovenia, but it's everywhere. But we are now, I don't know, at least, I don't know how many, what is the angle of the right-wingness that we moved since, let's say, either 60s or even 90s. And this is a big challenge. Also, now that I place myself in another context and with another questions and so on, it's very interesting. And in a way, I can say that it's a privilege, actually, to try to live in another context, in another life, in conditions that are very comfortable for me. I have a job, I'm not precarious anymore. I don't need to fight for everything. And in that sense, certainly there is a different perspective. But the challenge is amazing because questions that appear are on a different level, and the realness of questions that we were all bringing is somewhere else. And what you initially said, like these people can only talk about conditions of labor and context and so on. I'm asking myself, what else can you talk about? That's the essential thing. We were talking, there was a question about how we come together, like that is the thing, I think there is a continuation of that question. It's not only how we come together, but how we stay together, if we want to stay together. And I don't know, there are many questions that we deal, for example, in education context, that are really dramatic, inequality, for example. So plus what you mentioned already in terms of internationalization and people coming in a context that is kind of supposedly global. Okay? What does it mean? How do you work with that, and so on? What kind of censorship, implicit censorship this brings, but also economic. People are not equal. Our students, we have international programs, so where is the border of that internationality? At the moment, border is EU. Because within EU, you don't need to pay if you want to study in Germany. If you are out, you have to pay first, but you also have to go for an immense bureaucratic terror before you actually arrive there. So I think there is a lot of what Silvia was saying, symbolic openness and so on, and many things that actually talk pretty much against what we are talking.
We have, I think, time for one more question from the audience.
Yes, it's, thank you for the talk. I think it's probably maybe a way to wrap up, hopefully, because I feel that in different ways the answer has been like a specter circulating. But going back to the beginning of the terms of the discussion, going back to this idea of Post-Yugoslavia and dramaturgy, I was kind of like wondering all the time, what is the problem with it now, or what is that brings this family together in a way that, and then I was fantasizing around the fact that in some ways, what I hear is that you all, sorry, I said we, it's subconscious because I'm also part of another diaspora from Italy, and I hear a lot of that. But yeah, so there is this way of, I think, you have been subjectivized as part of this post-Yugoslavian fantasy that is somebody else's fantasy. And in a way, you become Yugoslavian getting out of that time space. And then I was kind of wondering, okay, this is, of course, is encountering the potentiating, the practices, and potentiating the history and the power of what that offers to bring into the world. But at the same time, I would like to hear a bit more what other terms could we have there to reclaim that as a legacy, because in a way, what I also see that makes it interesting for me to be here is that from another standpoint, it is true that this region, whatever the name you want to call it, is overrepresented at the level of excellent practices and theories in the field of dramaturgy today. So that's an interesting power that you have, and it's almost like the ghost of this having been made post-Yugoslav. And so that with great power comes great responsibility, as RuPaul would have it now. So in a way, what is the, how do you think of your own accountability today in trying to escape this double bind? And yes, and so I suppose what I'm trying to think about in terms of temporalities and geographies and contemporary politics of institutions is that in many of the European spaces that have been named, I think that dramaturgy appears at the moment when, yes, institutions maybe have embraced earlier some kind of avant-gardism or kind of diversity in the canon that is taught and passed on and put on stage. But that has often coincided with the neoliberalization of the mechanisms of these very institutions. So the state that we're talking about, when we talk about the state as provider of the arts and culture, deeply twists and pivots, and in the same token, in many Western countries, the moment we get the kind of practices we're all interested in, that make it into main space, it's also the moment when there is, again, another mechanism of potentiating that, and what they can be and do in the world. And I think the legacy here that I'm seeing in front of me is a completely different story, because it's not based on the social democratic consensus of post-war, bluntly included, And what I feel that is super exciting is that we're living in a time when that consensus is gone, bye-bye, and the right-wingers know this, with their bell or whatever it is they think, which is assigned to that function. And I think we're all looking for where is the accountability, where is our next accountability as somehow, and again, excuse the terms that have broadly defined that. Doing dramaturgy, left. Artist formerly known as. Okay. So this is more kind of sharing meditations and kind of, maybe a closing more. Okay.
The question is if we want to tackle this question at the very end of our conversation, which is a great question.
We'll write it into application for the next question.
What I also feel like I would like now maybe to close and leave maybe your question to resonate in space. I think I want to say thank you for all that left and all that stayed in their local context. And I also feel like that we only scratched a surface of a conversation that has potential to continue. And that's maybe still, not maybe, but I think it still makes sense talking about labor. And it's a privilege to do it publicly. So maybe we just continue.
The Germans? You're not talking to me. Some other, okay.
Some others. There are plenty of Germans to talk about it. But also Brits and everyone else. Dobro, ovo je svijetno.
Sve čuje na kameru, znaš. Dokumentaciju čuješ.
Opet mi dozvali. Kako to ide, Pavli? Nismo probali.
Ma da.
Okay, should we start?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Some people are missing, but we need to...
They are coming.
Speaking of time, we need to go, so yeah, just we go. So welcome to the last event of this two-day multiplier event. My name is Janez and I'm from the Academy of Dramatic Art. I'm moderating this panel, which was initially called Curating in Context, then it became Queer/Curating in Context. So this will be the horizon in which we will be surfing today. My guests today are Dimitrov, activist, curator, and theoretician from North Macedonia. Ivković, artist and cultural worker, and from coordinator or director of the City of Women in Slovenia, from Croatia to Slovenia, and Milohnić, artist from Croatia. Right? Yeah. Okay. So thank you for being here. My first question was supposed to be something else, but I thought it would be interesting to hop onto something that I wanted to leave for the end, because somehow it continues the discussion we had in the previous panel, and it actually concerns the historical perspective, so something that was mentioned in the little description of our panel. Given that the ex-Yugoslav context has a specific perspective in this sense, that the visibility of non-normative and queer practices and figures and poetics was quite rare. So I'm curious to hear, how do you reflect this specific, your position today in relation to this non-existent or maybe marginally existent and visible visibility of these other types of identities? Marko or Fazio? You said you're eager to speak about this, so go.
So can you just repeat shortly the question? I lost it. No, because it was formulated differently in your...
Okay, so should I read how it was formulated here?
Maybe, yeah.
Okay. So, in the description of the round table, you also pointed towards the historical perspective of the theme, the fact that there were very few artists in our common ex-Yugoslav history that have a clear perspective or that have dealt with gender and or sexuality from a non-normative position at all. And I would say this goes both for theory and curating as well. Are there any examples that actually define this thesis, and how does this lack reflect onto your own work and practice?
Okay, so I think I'm unable to speak about if there are like examples that define this thesis, and I hope Slavčo has some. But because I feel that I will enter this question through kind of negativity. Because when I was studying in the new media department at the Academy of Fine Arts, what I was, which is very closely tied to the Croatian art, art independent scene, was that queerness was thought of as this kind of disruptive force, very abstracted from sexuality. It mostly had to do with this, it kind of signaled this pleasurable or kind of edgy, spicy element in art. So what was mostly happening was that there were artists that were part of the canon, that were cis-het artists, that were being kind of reframed, recontextualized, and recoded as queer. So this was somehow when I finished my education in the Department of New Media, this was like, okay, now this is kind of what is queerness other than this disruptive negative force. And then I realized that because of this kind of huge gap, that there is no kind of precedent for this, that that there is a big danger to emulate whatever comes from the West, because the whole discourse, the whole aesthetics, everything is like whatever you import from the West. And so this is like kind of the position that I find myself in.
In terms of historical precedents in the concrete context, for me, have been highly informative. Examples coming from the ex-Yugoslav context. First, of course, there were practices which are related to gender critique, especially in performing arts. Names and practices more or less we are familiarized with, including the work of Sergej Ivković, partially with the work of Abramović, but also Vlasta Dilima. Tomislav Gotovac's work as well, that deals with masculinity even earlier in his Elle magazine performance for camera works. But in terms of queerness and sexuality, what I find to be extremely important and historically important to be revived is maybe a utopian looking backwards in order to imagine different possibilities in terms of how we think queerness in political, social, and cultural context are examples coming from early 80s in Slovenia and Vujanović, alternative and punk scene in particular. Just to mention Meje Control 4, Borders Control 4 of Aida Schmidt and Grzinić. Their video artwork, but also performances for video, and the alternative scene of which they were part, which was also, I think, in thinking about curatorial practices important in terms of bringing together not only what we call now transdisciplinarity, but also bringing different art forms, different art media, experimenting with art forms, experimenting with theater and with spaces, especially for presentation of artworks. And what for me also is very formative, bringing art practices within clubs, for example. And in this scene, not only Meje Control 4, but also Borgesia, for me, are probably one of the most important formative historical examples. Not only in terms of their music practice, but also their video works, which are also artworks by themselves, and how they tackle questions related to sexuality and power, sexuality and gender, but also in bringing to the forefront subversive, alternative, and underground sexual practices such as leather culture, such as SM practices within their video works, which of course I assume would be much more shocking to present nowadays than the reactions they had at their time. Just for an example, a few months ago, there was the parade taking place in Skopje. My attitude towards parade is always very ambivalent, so I try to support, considering the context, the parade, but also to introduce something else which I find to be a more radical queer perspective. And I had a transparent that had a quote from one song called Borgesia. God is talking, mother is talking, party is talking, we are fucking. And like a few media got that transparent in photos, and it was like a scandal. They were like shocked, and I was like, okay, it's 2021, Borgesia, we're doing this in 1984. So Borgesia's work in those terms is also, I find, is a very important precedent for now. And the work of Dusan Mandić, who was part of the new collective and the entire scene in Ljubljana, especially one graffiti that he did in the clubs where they were doing a lot of their shows, but also parties, was enormous wall graffiti of two men having sex and It was written 68 is over, 84 is over, the future is between your legs. So this motto actually from the Dusan Mankic wrote, I used it also for one of the festivals I was doing a few years ago, which is a festival for alternative video and sexuality in Yugoslavia. So in those terms, I do think that we have very rare but valuable and important precedent in our Yugoslav context, which I think can help us imagine some utopian futures to quote Jose Esteban Munoz. We can still look in the past in order to get a glimpse towards certain utopian future. So those would be my examples. And of course, let's not forget that probably it was the first, I think, maybe in Europe, the Magnus Festival for homosexual arts and culture in '84 that took part in Ljubljana, and there were, which was like kind of radical and important in wider European frames, not only for our Yugoslav context. And Guy Ockinghem, for example, was present in Ljubljana, and Ockinghem is again becoming important name with his book Homosexual Desire and other writings of his. So in those terms, there are very few things which I think we can find still very valuable and learn from.